Story 1. When I was around 12 or 13, my buddies and I were big into bowling. There was this bowling alley just a short walk down the street from our neighborhood, so it became our go-to hangout spot every weekend. It was cheap, which was perfect because, honestly, we were just broke kids. That one weekend, it was me, my friends Chris, Joey, and Mike. We always went at night, probably around 8 o'clock this time. The place was usually packed on weekends, and we'd often spot some familiar faces. There was this older guy who stood out, though, and not in a good way. He always bowled alone on the adult side of the alley where they served alcohol. We stuck to the kid-friendly lanes, but this guy caught our attention because he had this weird habit of pacing down the lanes, just watching people bowl. Then he'd wander back to his own lane. We nicknamed him Creeper Bob after seeing him do this a few times. That night, Bob decided to sit in the lane right next to us. He started setting up a solo game, and it did not take long for him to try and chat us up. At first, it was just comments about our bowling form or random remarks about how long he had been coming to the alley. But then he said something that made us all uncomfortable. He admitted he had been watching us play every weekend from across the alley. He said he came over to introduce himself that night, acting like he wanted to teach us how to bowl better. It was weird and annoying, but more than that, it felt creepy. At one point, while I was up to bowl, Bob crossed into our lane. He grabbed my wrist to adjust my stance without asking. I froze up. What was I supposed to say? I was just a kid, and none of us knew how to stand up to him. The whole thing was unsettling. Eventually, we all had enough and decided to leave early. Instead of spending the rest of our money on more games, we got pizza at a place down the street. After we ate, Mike and Chris headed off toward their homes. Joey and I walked together since we lived in the same direction. As we were walking, we heard a car engine start behind us. We turned to see an old SUV, looked like a Ford Explorer, making a three-point turn. Right away, we both thought it might be Creeper Bob. The SUV started trailing us, so we picked up the pace. Sure enough, the car pulled up next to us, and the window rolled down. It was him. He offered us a ride home, saying, "It is not safe for kids to be out this late." We were not little kids, we were teenagers, but he said it in this way that felt manipulative, like he thought we would actually get in. When we refused, he pulled over and parked. Joey and I looked at each other, then started jogging. At the intersection where we usually split up, we said a quick goodbye, and I kept running all the way home. By the time I got to my house, I was out of breath. Running right after eating pizza is no joke. My dad was asleep because he worked weekends, and my mom and sister were out. I did not want to wake anyone, so I went around back to get the spare key from the shed. As I was unlocking the door, I heard something. My gut told me to pay attention, but I brushed it off. The moment I opened the door, I felt someone run up behind me. Before I could even turn, a man shoved me inside, covering my mouth with one hand and grabbing me around the neck with the other. I tried to fight back, clawing at his hand until I could free my mouth just enough to scream, "Dad." I must have startled him because he let go and bolted out the door. I did not look back. I just ran upstairs, shouting for my dad. He came rushing out, and after I told him what happened, he searched the backyard and the whole property. Then he called the police to file a report. I told him everything about Bob, from the bowling alley to him following us in his SUV. My dad even tried to get the bowling alley to hand over their surveillance footage, but they refused. My mom was horrified when she found out, and she never let me go back there again. Not that I ever wanted to. I cannot say for certain that the man who attacked me was Creeper Bob, but come on, what are the odds it was not him? Story 2. Back when I was a teenager, my group of friends and I were what you might call troublemakers. We loved breaking rules, stirring up chaos, and exploring places where we were not supposed to be. Growing up in a suburb in northern New Jersey, we were just a bunch of spoiled kids with too much free time and not enough common sense. Looking back, I can admit some of the stuff we got into was pretty dumb, but at the time, it was just how we passed the nights. One thing we loved doing was exploring late at night. Abandoned buildings were our usual spots, though we were not too picky. We even got banned from our middle school once for sneaking in through an open window, but that is a story for another day. This particular night, though, we had something riskier in mind. There were 5 of us: me, Charlie, Eric, Jake, and Ravi. Jake was always jumping from one job to another, It became kind of a running joke for us. He would quit as fast as he got hired, usually for some ridiculous reason. At the time, he had just started a job as a night attendant at a bowling alley a couple of towns over. You can probably see where this is going. Jake had been trusted with the keys to close up the alley the night before, and Ravi, who could talk anyone into anything, somehow convinced Jake to let us check out the bowling alley at 3 in the morning. I swear, Ravi could talk a person out of their life savings if he wanted to. I have not heard from him in a while, though. I think he might actually be in jail now. We all agreed to get a little drunk before heading out. Everyone except Eric had their share. He refused to drink if he was driving, and since he always insisted on taking his dad's BMW, he liked having the power to call it a night whenever he wanted. So, after we had all gotten a buzz, Eric drove us to the bowling alley. I was the heavy drinker of the group, not something I am proud of now, but back then, it was just who I was. It also made me a little too relaxed in risky situations. When we arrived, Jake unlocked the door, and we all slipped inside. Charlie was the cautious one and kept nagging us to be careful in his squeaky voice. Jake told us we could not actually bowl, which was disappointing. But in my drunken brilliance, I suggested we use the lanes as slip-and-slides. That ended up being hilarious and kept us entertained for a while. Eventually, we got tired and asked Jake if there were any backrooms we could check out. He led us into the employee-only area and then to a storage room. We started rummaging around, flipping things over, and being the reckless idiots we were. None of us cared much because we figured Jake would probably quit soon anyway. Just as we were getting bored, we heard a loud thud from below us. We froze, staring at each other. Eric, the only sober one, asked if the place had a basement. Jake looked just as surprised as we were and said he had no idea. Ravi, of course, grinned, ready to dive into the mystery, while Charlie started panicking, saying Jake was definitely going to get fired. As we whispered back and forth, Eric noticed a rug in the corner. He pulled it up, revealing a hatch. The mood instantly changed. Suddenly, this was no longer some harmless game. The noise we had heard was still unexplained, and now there was this hidden basement. None of us really wanted to go down, but Eric opened the hatch and shined his phone flashlight into the darkness. Without waiting, he climbed down the ladder. I still had plenty of liquid courage, so I followed. Ravi came next, and Jake hesitated before bringing up the rear. Charlie flat out refused to come down. The basement was dusty and cramped, with cardboard boxes piled high. It seemed harmless enough at first, but then Ravi spotted a door in the corner. Eric put his hand on the handle, but just as he was about to open it, we heard the same loud bump from the other side of the door. We all froze, looking at each other in pure terror. It was too loud to be an animal. Against my better judgment, I turned to leave, but Eric cracked the door open. Inside was another storage room, but that was not all. Sitting in the corner, with legs crossed and back to us, was a human figure. We stood there, frozen, unable to move. Then, without warning, the person started banging their head against the wall. That was the sound we had been hearing. Panic set in. I quietly made my way back to the ladder, and the others followed. But Jake tripped over some junk on the floor and cursed under his breath. The person in the room screamed, and all hell broke loose. Eric and I scrambled up the ladder with Ravi close behind. Charlie, who had been waiting above, leaned over to help. Just as Ravi made it out, we heard Jake scream, "Get off me!" I ran back to the hatch and saw Charlie toss a metal pipe down into the basement. There was a blood-curdling scream, and Jake scrambled up the ladder. Charlie yanked him out, slammed the hatch shut, and we all bolted for the door. Jake managed to lock it with shaking hands before we piled into the car. On the drive back, Jake told us what had happened. Apparently, the person had jumped on his back and clawed at him. Charlie's pipe had hit the attacker, allowing Jake to escape. He described the guy as a filthy, wild-looking man with a nest of hair on his head. Jake quit his job the very next day without explaining why. We never figured out how that man ended up in the basement, but the fact that it had been hidden made us wonder if Jake's boss knew something. I have not been bowling since that night. The thought of it still gives me the creeps. Story 3. One evening, my girlfriend, Emily, and I decided it might be fun to go bowling. We hopped in the car and headed to the nearest bowling alley. Once there, We went through the usual routine, renting shoes, picking out balls, and setting up a lane. Neither of us had bowled in years, so it was safe to say we were both pretty terrible. Emily was getting frustrated because most of her throws went straight into the gutter. I was doing slightly better, but not enough to offer any real advice. To make things worse, Emily's ex-boyfriend, Derek, showed up with his group of friends and took a lane just a few spots down from us. Emily noticed him right away and immediately turned away, whispering to me that she wanted to leave. Not wanting her to feel uncomfortable, we decided to cut our game short. She waited in the car while I returned the shoes. I am pretty sure Derek saw me at the counter, but I avoided eye contact and did not mention it to Emily. When we got home, we decided to salvage the night by playing Wii bowling instead. I opened a bottle of wine, and we set up the game in the living room. It turned out to be way more fun than the real thing. We played for about half an hour, laughing and enjoying the music we had on in the background. But then, as one song ended and there was a brief moment of silence, we both heard a noise from upstairs. It sounded like something heavy being dropped onto the floor. Emily and I exchanged glances. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her eyes wide. I nodded, feeling my stomach tighten. I turned off the music, and we sat in silence for a moment. The house was eerily quiet. "I'll go check it out," I said, grabbing my phone for light. I went upstairs, carefully checking each room. I looked under beds, opened closets, and turned on every light as I went. I did not find anything out of place, nor was there any sign of something falling. Relieved, I went back downstairs, figuring it must have been our imagination, or maybe the house settling. We resumed playing Wii bowling and sipping wine, eventually taking our little party upstairs to the bedroom. Emily was tipsy, so she fell asleep pretty quickly, but I stayed up for a bit before finally dozing off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to another noise. This time, it was louder and clearer, the unmistakable thud of something heavy being dropped. My heart started pounding as I realized it was coming from above us, but we were already upstairs. That left only one possibility: the attic. The attic door was right outside our bedroom. It was one of those pull-down types with a ladder that unfolded. I quietly got out of bed, careful not to wake Emily. Standing beneath the attic door, I listened. Every few seconds, I heard a faint creaking sound, like someone shifting their weight. I grabbed a broom from the closet, more for comfort than anything else, and pulled down the attic ladder. The creaking stopped as soon as the ladder extended. I climbed up slowly, my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. When my head reached the attic level, I froze. There, in the corner of the attic, was an old rocking chair, and sitting in it was a man. He was slowly rocking back and forth, his face hidden in shadow. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process what I was seeing. Gathering what little courage I had, I yelled, "Who are you?" My voice cracked, but it was loud enough to startle the man. He stopped rocking and turned his head toward me. I could barely make out his face, but his eyes glinted in the light of my phone. Then he made this low, guttural growling noise that sent chills down my spine. He stood up suddenly, and that was all it took for me to scramble back down the ladder. I pushed the attic door up, slamming it shut, and yelled for Emily to call the police. She woke up in a panic, but quickly grabbed her phone. I stayed under the attic door, holding it shut as the man above started banging and kicking it. "Hurry!" I shouted to Emily. The man's laughter echoed from the attic. It was deranged, almost animalistic. He started speaking in a language I did not understand, his words slurred and angry. My arms were shaking from holding the door closed, but I refused to let go. When the police finally arrived, Emily let them in, and they quickly took over. 2 officers went up into the attic while we stayed downstairs, clinging to each other on the couch. Minutes later, they came back down, escorting the man in handcuffs. He looked right at me as they walked him through the living room. His expression was a mix of hatred and madness, his lips twisted in a sneer. We later found out that he was a homeless man who had likely entered through an open window in the backyard. Why he chose our house, we will never know. But the attic had been his hiding place, and the rocking chair his throne of terror. That night changed everything. We made sure every window and door was locked from then on. And as for the attic, I sealed it shut the very next day. Emily and I tried to move on, But the memory of that man sitting in the rocking chair still haunts me. Some nights, I can still hear the creak of the chair in my dreams.